The meeting was scheduled for 7:30 in the morning. My boss chose the time deliberately, early enough that I'd arrive flustered, off balance, still shaking off sleep. Walter Briggs didn't know I'd been awake since 4 a.m. for the past 6 months, working split shifts between the hospital's rehab wing and the outpatient clinic across town. 7:30 was practically sleeping in. If you've ever wondered how these kinds of stories end, consider following this channel, because what happened next took 8 weeks, 4 depositions, and a settlement large enough to rewrite the ending completely. I've been a physical therapist for 11 years. You learn early that healing isn't linear. A knee rebuilds itself in stages: inflammation, proliferation, remodeling. Scar tissue forms where ligaments tore. The body compensates, then overcorrects, then finally stabilizes into something new. You can't rush it. You document everything. You note the angle of flexion, the patient's pain scale, the heat in the joint. You watch for patterns. And when something doesn't align, when the charts say one thing and the patient's gait says another, you investigate. I've always thought of people the same way. Everyone compensates. Everyone develops scar tissue where they've been hurt before. And everyone, if you watch closely enough, reveals exactly what they're protecting. I grew up in Spokane, in a neighborhood where your worth was measured in how many hours you worked and whether you complained. My father drove trucks. My mother cleaned houses. I put myself through school on loans and a job at a nursing home, turning patients every 2 hours through the night shift so they wouldn't develop bedsores. I learned anatomy by feel before I ever saw it in a textbook, where the hip socket sits, how a shoulder rotates, the difference between muscle spasm and bone-deep pain. The work suited me. I liked the problem solving, the way every body was a puzzle with slightly different pieces. And I liked that results were measurable. Degree of motion. Pounds of pressure. Pain scale dropped from 7 to 3. There was no ambiguity. You either improved or you didn't. St. Margaret's Hospital hired me right out of graduate school. It wasn't the most prestigious rehab department in the state, but it was solid, stable. Walter Briggs had been the director for 9 years by then, a man who'd built his reputation on efficiency metrics and cost reduction. He liked his therapists young, eager, and too inexperienced to push back when he cut session times or double-booked rooms. I didn't push back, not at first. I worked. I stayed late. I took on the patients no one else wanted, the post-stroke cases who'd need 6 months of work, the spinal injury recoveries who sobbed through every session. I built my caseload carefully, the way you'd build muscle. Steady load. Incremental progress. It wasn't until year 3 that I started noticing the discrepancies. A patient would be discharged after 4 sessions when the standard protocol called for 12. Insurance would approve 20 visits, but the notes would reflect only 8. Sessions marked as 45 minutes that I knew had been cut to 20 because Walter had double-booked the room and pulled me out early. At first I thought it was clerical error, someone in billing misreading the charts. Then I started paying attention. Walter had a system. He'd schedule patients in overlapping blocks, counting on the fact that some would cancel or arrive late. When they didn't, he'd pull therapists out of sessions early, mark the notes as complete, and bill insurance for the full time. The patients rarely complained, they didn't know how long a session was supposed to last. And the therapists didn't complain because Walter made it clear that employment was a privilege, not a right, and Spokane didn't have endless job openings for people who made waves. I didn't say anything. Not then. I started keeping my own notes instead, a separate log, stored in a folder on my laptop, backed up to a drive I kept in my car. I noted the discrepancies. The timestamps. The patient names. The insurance codes. I told myself I was just being thorough, the way I'd been trained. Document everything. Patterns don't lie. By year 5, I had a file 3 inches thick. It was around that time that Vanessa started. She was 24, just out of school, bright-eyed and warm in the way that made patients relax instantly. Walter hired her on a Thursday and by Friday had started scheduling her for back-to-back sessions with no break in between. She lasted 2 months before she came to me in the break room, hands shaking, and told me Walter had cornered her in the supply closet and suggested her schedule might improve if she was friendlier. I told her to document it. She said she didn't want to cause trouble. I said trouble was already here, it was just a question of who would carry it. She reported it to Human Resources the following Monday. Walter called it a misunderstanding. A joke taken out of context. Vanessa was young, he said. Nervous. Prone to exaggeration under stress. HR accepted his explanation and reminded Vanessa that baseless accusations could damage workplace morale. She resigned 2 weeks later. I started paying closer attention after that. And once I did, the pattern became impossible to ignore. There had been 4 other young women in the past 3 years. All hired with enthusiasm. All gone within 6 months. I'd assumed turnover was just part of the culture, low pay, high stress, long hours. But when I pulled the names and cross-referenced them with the HR complaints I wasn't supposed to know about, the picture clarified. Every single one had reported something. A comment. A touch. An invitation that felt less like networking and more like a test. And every single one had been dismissed, reassigned, or quietly pressured out. I didn't go to HR. I'd watched what happened to Vanessa. I knew how that ended. Instead, I went to coffee. There was a cafe 2 blocks from the hospital called The Mill. I'd been going there for years, usually alone, usually between shifts. The owner knew my order: black coffee, no sugar, sometimes a scone if I hadn't eaten since dawn. It was the kind of place where you could sit by the window and watch the street without anyone bothering you. I started noticing him around month 7 of my documentation project. He came in at odd hours, always alone, always with a leather briefcase that looked expensive but worn, the kind of thing you keep because it works, not because it's new. He ordered tea. He read actual newspapers. And once, when I dropped my pen and it rolled under his table, he handed it back and said, "Long shift." I said, something like that. His name was Adrian Hale. I learned that 3 weeks later, when I finally sat down at his table instead of just nodding as I passed. He was a lawyer, he said. Employment and labor law, mostly. Some civil rights work. He'd moved to Spokane from Seattle 2 years earlier because he was tired of corporate defense work and wanted to do something that let him sleep at night. I didn't tell him what I was working on. Not then. But over the next few months, we kept running into each other. Same cafe. Same quiet corner. And slowly, in pieces, I started asking hypothetical questions. If someone noticed a pattern of billing fraud, what would they need to prove it? If someone reported harassment and was retaliated against, what constitutes retaliation legally? If someone had documentation spanning 5 years, how much would be enough? Adrian never asked if I was speaking hypothetically or personally. He just answered. Carefully. Precisely. The way you'd explain a rehab protocol to someone who'd never seen one before. By month 10, I wasn't speaking hypothetically anymore. I gave him the file on a Tuesday in March. He read it over the course of a week and called me back to the mill on a Thursday evening. He ordered tea. I ordered coffee. He set the folder on the table between us and said, "This is enough for a federal case." Maybe 2. I didn't react. I'd trained myself not to. He continued. Medicare fraud. Insurance fraud. Possible RICO if we can prove the billing scheme was systematic and involved other staff. The harassment complaints add a separate layer: hostile work environment, retaliation, constructive dismissal. If we bring this to the Department of Justice and the EEOC simultaneously, they'll have to investigate. It won't be quiet. And it won't be quick. I asked how long. He said, 6 months, maybe more. You'll be deposed. So will everyone else on staff. Walter will lawyer up. The hospital will try to settle early to avoid publicity. If you take a settlement, you'll likely be bound by an NDA. If you don't, this goes to trial, and trial is ugly. I stared at my coffee. It had gone cold. I asked, what happens to the patients? Adrian looked at me for a long moment. If the fraud case sticks, the hospital will have to audit every billing record for the past 7 years and refund Medicare for every fraudulent claim. That's millions of dollars. It'll probably trigger an external review of the entire rehab department. Some patients will get refunds. Some will get apology letters. None of that fixes what already happened. I said, but it stops it from happening again. He nodded. Yes. It does. I told him to file it. He said he needed my formal statement first. I met him at his office the following week, a small suite on the 3rd floor of a building near the courthouse, the kind of place where the heat clanked in the pipes and the floors creaked. I spent 4 hours walking him through every entry in my file. He recorded the whole thing. When we were done, he said, "You know he's going to come for you." I said, "I know." Adrian filed the complaints on April 2nd. The DOJ doesn't move fast, but the EEOC does, especially when the case involves multiple women and a paper trail. Within 2 weeks, an investigator contacted me for a preliminary interview. Within 4 weeks, HR got the letter. I knew the moment it arrived because Walter's door stayed closed all morning. He called me in at 7:30 a.m. on a Wednesday. Same time as always. Same chair across from his desk. Same view of the parking lot through the window behind him. He didn't yell. That wasn't Walter's style. He spoke quietly, the way you'd speak to a child who'd disappointed you. He said I'd been a valued member of the team. That my work had always been appreciated. But recent developments had made it clear that my relationship with the department had become untenable. For the good of the hospital, for the morale of the staff, and for my own well-being, he was asking me to resign. He slid a paper across the desk. A resignation letter, already typed, with a blank space for my signature. He said, "Sign this, and we part on good terms. You'll get 2 weeks severance and a neutral reference. If you don't sign, I'll have security escort you out today, and your file will reflect termination for cause." I looked at the letter. I looked at Walter. His face was calm. His hands were folded. He thought he'd already won. I picked up the pen. I signed my name. Then I stood up. And I stayed standing. Walter blinked. He'd expected me to leave. Most people do, sign the paper, take the severance, walk out quietly. The system relies on that. On people being too tired, too scared, too beaten down to do anything but comply. I said, "I'll be gone by the end of the day." He nodded, already reaching for his phone. I walked out of his office, down the hallway, past the therapy rooms where my colleagues were running their morning sessions. I didn't stop to explain. I didn't say goodbye. I went to my locker, pulled out the box I'd packed the night before, and carried it to my car. Then I drove to Adrian's office and told him it was done. He said, "Good. Now we wait." Waiting, in my line of work, is its own skill. You wait for the swelling to go down. You wait for the bone to knit. You wait for the nervous system to remember how a movement is supposed to feel. Healing happens in the gaps between action. The body does its best work when you stop forcing it. I took a job at a small outpatient clinic on the north side of town. The pay was lower, the hours were longer, but no one there knew Walter Briggs or cared what had happened at St. Margaret's. I worked. I documented. I stayed off social media. I didn't talk about the case, not even to friends who asked why I'd left the hospital so suddenly. Adrian called every 2 weeks with updates. The EEOC had interviewed 3 of the women who'd left before Vanessa. 2 were willing to give statements. The DOJ had subpoenaed St. Margaret's billing records going back 6 years. The hospital's legal team had requested a meeting to discuss resolution options. I asked what that meant. Adrian said, "It means they're scared." By July, the hospital offered a settlement. A sum large enough to make my hands shake when Adrian told me the number. In exchange, I would sign an NDA, agree not to pursue further legal action, and never speak publicly about Walter Briggs or St. Margaret's billing practices. I asked what would happen to Walter if I took it. Adrian said, probably nothing. The hospital will claim they've addressed the issue internally. He might get a write-up. He'll definitely keep his job. I asked what would happen if I didn't take it. He said, we go to trial. It'll take another year, maybe longer. You'll be cross-examined. They'll try to discredit you, paint you as disgruntled, opportunistic, unreliable. You might win. You might not. And even if you do, the payout might not be any bigger than what they're offering now. I thought about Vanessa. About the 4 women before her. About the patients who'd been billed for sessions they never received, who trusted that the system was working the way it was supposed to. I said, no settlement. Adrian didn't argue. He just nodded and said, all right. Then we go forward. The hospital's tone changed after that. The polite requests for meetings stopped. The legal letters got sharper. They filed motions to dismiss, to delay, to suppress evidence. Adrian countered every one. The case inched forward like a patient relearning to walk, slow, halting, but undeniably progressing. In September, the DOJ announced they were opening a formal investigation into Medicare fraud at St. Margaret's. The local news picked it up. Not front page, but enough that people noticed. I started getting messages, former colleagues asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, if the rumors were true. I didn't respond. In October, Walter's lawyer requested a deposition. I spent 6 hours in a conference room answering questions about my employment history, my patient notes, my reasons for keeping a separate file. Walter's lawyer was good. He made it sound like I was paranoid, obsessive, someone who couldn't let go of minor grievances. Adrian objected, redirected, clarified. When it was over, he walked me to my car and said, you did well. I didn't feel like I'd done well. I felt like I'd been taken apart and badly reassembled. But the case moved forward. In November, 2 more former employees came forward with harassment complaints. Both had left St. Margaret's in the past 18 months. Both had been told their concerns were unfounded. The EOC amended the complaint to include them. By December, the hospital made a second settlement offer. Bigger than the first. Still with an NDA. I said no again. Adrian said, you know they're going to make this as painful as possible. I said, I know. What I didn't say was that pain, in my line of work, is information. It tells you where the damage is. It tells you what needs attention. And if you're trained to read it correctly, it tells you when healing has begun. The trial date was set for March. I worked. I saw patients. I went to the mill for coffee. Adrian and I didn't talk about the case when we met there anymore, we talked about other things. Books. Weather. The way the light changed as winter set in. It felt important, somehow, to remember that life continued around the case, that I was still a person who existed outside of depositions and legal motions. In January, the hospital's billing director resigned. No explanation given. 2 weeks later, the CFO followed. Adrian called me the day the news broke. He said, they're cleaning house. That's a good sign. I asked what it meant for the case. He said, it means they know they're going to lose. The trial was held in the federal courthouse in downtown Spokane, a granite building with tall windows and courtroom benches worn smooth by decades of nervous hands. I arrived early on the first day, before the lawyers, before the journalists who'd started following the case once the fraud charges became public. I sat in the hallway outside Courtroom 3 and watched people walk past, attorneys with briefcases, clerks with file carts, a woman clutching a tissue and whispering into her phone. Everyone in a courthouse is carrying something. A divorce. A bankruptcy. An injury claim. A betrayal. You can see it in the way they hold themselves, the way they avoid eye contact or seek it desperately. I'd spent 11 years helping people carry pain. Now I was carrying my own. Adrian arrived at 8:15. He set his briefcase down beside me and said, "Ready?" I said, "No." He smiled. "Good. People who say they're ready are usually lying." The trial lasted 9 days. The hospital's defense was predictable: billing errors were clerical mistakes, not fraud. Walter's behavior had been misinterpreted. I was a disgruntled employee with a history of being difficult to manage. They brought in a former supervisor who said I'd always been overly meticulous and resistant to feedback. Adrian cross-examined her for 40 minutes. By the end, she admitted that overly meticulous meant I'd flagged discrepancies in patient charts that others had missed, and resistant to feedback meant I'd questioned why session times were being cut short. The jury took notes. The DOJ's fraud investigator testified on day 4. He walked the jury through the billing records: 1,700 sessions billed as 45 minutes that had been documented internally as 30 or less. Over 6 years, the hospital had overbilled Medicare by an estimated $2.3 million. Walter sat at the defense table, face blank, hands folded. On day 6, Vanessa testified. She was shaking so hard the judge offered her water twice. She described the supply closet, the comment, the way Walter had smiled when he said her schedule could be adjusted. She described going to HR, being told she was overreacting, and finally resigning because she couldn't afford to be unemployed but couldn't afford to stay, either. The defense attorney asked if she had any physical evidence. Any recordings? Any witnesses? She said no. He asked if it was possible she'd misunderstood. She looked at him and said, "No. I understood perfectly." On day 7, I testified. Adrian walked me through my employment history, my documentation process, my reasons for keeping a separate file. He entered my logs into evidence: 300 pages of discrepancies, session notes, timestamps, patient names. He asked me why I hadn't reported the billing issues sooner. I said, because I wanted to be sure. In my work, you don't make a diagnosis based on one data point. You look for patterns. I needed to know the pattern was real before I said anything. The defense attorney cross-examined me for 2 hours. He suggested I'd fabricated the logs. That I'd kept them as leverage. That I was motivated by money, by bitterness, by a desire for revenge. I sat with my hands in my lap and answered every question the same way I'd answer a patient asking why an exercise hurt, calmly, specifically, with evidence. He asked if I'd ever made a billing error myself. I said, yes. Twice. Both times I caught it and corrected it before the claim was submitted. He asked if I thought I was better than my colleagues. I said, no. I think I paid attention. By day 8, the hospital changed strategies. Their lawyer requested a sidebar. When the judge called a recess, Adrian told me they were offering a settlement again, this time with no NDA, plus a formal apology and a commitment to third-party billing audits for the next 5 years. I asked what he thought I should do. He said, "That's not my call. But I'll tell you this, you've already won. The fraud investigation is independent now. The DOJ doesn't drop cases just because you settle. Walter's career is over whether you take the money or not. The question is whether you want to spend another 3 weeks watching his lawyer try to tear you apart on the stand." I thought about it for 10 minutes. Then I said, "I want the jury to decide." We went back in. Closing arguments happened on day 9. The defense painted me as a crusader who'd manufactured a conspiracy out of ordinary workplace friction. Adrian painted the hospital as an institution that had prioritized profit over patients and silenced anyone who tried to speak up. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict slowly, looking at the judge instead of the gallery. Liable for Medicare fraud. Liable for hostile work environment. Liable for retaliation. Damages awarded, $1.8 million. Walter didn't move. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight, hands still folded on the table in front of him. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I sat very still and felt the air go out of the room, the way it does when a bone finally sets after weeks of waiting. Adrian leaned over and whispered, "It's done." I nodded. It was. The hospital released a statement that evening. It expressed disappointment in the verdict, emphasized their commitment to patient care, and announced that Director of Rehabilitation Walter Briggs had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. He was fired 6 days later. The news didn't name the reason, but anyone who'd followed the trial knew. The hospital couldn't afford to keep him, not with the DOJ investigation still ongoing, not with the media attention, not with the jury's verdict on record. Walter had built his career on efficiency and cost control. In the end, he became a cost the hospital couldn't justify. I heard through a former colleague that he'd cleaned out his office on a Sunday, when no one else was there. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't send an email. He just took his name placard off the door and left. I never saw him again. The settlement funds were transferred in April, after the hospital exhausted its appeals options. $1.8 million, minus legal fees and taxes, left me with a sum I'd never imagined having. I didn't buy a new car. I didn't take a vacation. I paid off my student loans in full, 11 years of debt, gone in a single wire transfer. Then I put the rest into a savings account and went back to work. The outpatient clinic where I'd been working offered me a permanent position. I took it. The work was the same, post-surgical rehab, sports injuries, geriatric mobility cases, but the environment was different. No double-booked rooms. No sessions cut short. No one looking over my shoulder and suggesting I could see more patients if I just worked a little faster. I stayed for 2 years. In that time, 3 things happened. First, the DOJ's investigation concluded. St. Margaret's Hospital was fined $4.2 million and required to implement third-party billing oversight for 7 years. 2 administrators were charged with fraud. 1 took a plea deal. The other went to trial and lost. Second, Vanessa called me. She'd gone back to school and earned a degree in social work. She was working at a women's shelter in Seattle, helping survivors of domestic violence navigate the legal system. She said she'd thought about calling me 100 times but wasn't sure I'd want to hear from her. I told her I was glad she called. She asked if I ever regretted it, going to trial, turning down the settlements, choosing the hard path when an easier one was right in front of me. I said, no. Not once. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." I said, "You were the one who had the courage to report it first." She said, "And you were the one who made sure it mattered." We didn't stay in close touch after that, but we exchanged messages on birthdays, on anniversaries of the verdict. Small reminders that we'd both survived something we weren't supposed to have to survive in the first place. Third, Adrian and I kept meeting for coffee. It started the same way it had before, separately, coincidentally, 2 people who happened to like the same quiet cafe at the same odd hours. But over time it became intentional. Thursday mornings, before my first patient. Sunday afternoons, after his long runs. We talked about work sometimes, but mostly we talked about other things. He told me about the cases he was taking now, employment law, still, but also tenant rights and wage theft. I told him about my patients, the small victories that no one else would think to celebrate. A year after the trial, he asked if I'd ever considered teaching. I said I hadn't. He said, "You should. You're good at explaining things. And there are a lot of people who need to learn how to pay attention the way you do." I thought about it for a few weeks. Then I reached out to the community college in Spokane and asked if they needed adjunct instructors for their physical therapist assistant program. They did. I started teaching 1 class a semester, Fundamentals of Patient Documentation. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't pay well. But I liked it. I liked showing 18-year-olds how to take notes that would hold up under scrutiny, how to spot discrepancies, how to trust their own observations even when someone in authority told them they were wrong. On the first day of every semester, I told them the same thing: your job is not to be liked. Your job is not to be fast. Your job is to be accurate. If you see something that doesn't make sense, write it down. If you see it twice, investigate. If you see it 3 times, speak up. The patients can't advocate for themselves. That's why we're here. Some of them took it to heart. Some didn't. But every semester, at least one student would come to my office hours and say they'd noticed something: an inconsistency in a chart, a protocol that didn't match the textbook, a supervisor cutting corners. And every time, I'd say, document it. And then decide what you want to do. Most of them didn't do anything. They were young, scared, trying to get through school and into a job that would pay the rent. I didn't blame them. But some did. And that was enough. By the 3rd year after the trial, I'd built a life that looked nothing like the one I'd had before. I was still a physical therapist, that hadn't changed, but everything around it had shifted. I worked 3 days a week at the clinic, taught 2 evenings a semester, and spent the rest of my time on something I hadn't expected: consulting. It started with a phone call from an attorney in Seattle. She'd read about the St. Margaret's case and wanted to know if I'd be willing to review billing records for a similar case she was building. I said I wasn't an accountant. She said she didn't need an accountant, she needed someone who understood how rehab sessions were supposed to be documented and could spot when the documentation didn't match the billing. I said I'd look at it. The case took 3 months. The billing fraud was even more blatant than Walter's: entire sessions fabricated, patients billed for services they'd never received, documentation copied and pasted across multiple charts without even changing the dates. I wrote a report. The attorney used it in her case. The clinic settled before trial. She referred me to another attorney. Then another. Within a year, I was reviewing records for cases across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. I didn't advertise. I didn't build a website. I just worked carefully, wrote clearly, and answered my phone when people called. The work suited me. It was investigative, detail-oriented, and it mattered. Every fraudulent claim I helped expose meant money returned to Medicare, to insurance companies, to patients who'd been overcharged. It didn't undo the harm, it never does, but it stopped the bleeding. Adrian once asked me if I ever got tired of it. Of looking for the worst in people. I said, I'm not looking for the worst. I'm looking for the truth. Most people are honest. But the ones who aren't do a lot of damage, and someone has to be willing to see it. He smiled. That's a very physical therapist answer. I said, what would a lawyer answer? He said, the same thing. Just with more footnotes. We'd been seeing each other, by then, in a way that wasn't quite dating but wasn't quite not dating. Coffee had turned into dinners. Dinners had turned into weekends. Neither of us had formally acknowledged it, but when I got the flu in January, he showed up at my apartment with soup and didn't leave until I could stand up without getting dizzy. In March, he asked if I wanted to move in with him. I said, I'll think about it. I did think about it. For 2 weeks. I made a list of pros and cons, the way I'd make a treatment plan. Proximity to the clinic. Rent savings. The fact that I already spent 4 nights a week at his place anyway. The fact that I trusted him in a way I hadn't trusted anyone in years. In the end, it wasn't the practical reasons that decided it. It was something he said one evening when we were sitting on his couch, not talking about anything in particular. He said, you know, you don't have to keep proving you can handle things alone. I looked at him. He said, I know you can. You've already proved it. But you don't have to keep doing it just because you can. I moved in April. It wasn't perfect. I'm not good at sharing space. I need silence in the mornings and I hate when people reorganize my kitchen. But Adrian didn't try to fix me or smooth my edges. He just made room. And I made room for him. By the 4th year, I'd stopped counting time in relation to the trial. It wasn't 3 years after or 4 years since. It was just my life. I still taught. I still consulted. I still worked at the clinic, though I'd cut back to 2 days a week. I didn't need the money the way I used to, but I needed the patience. I needed the reminder that most of the work is small and unglamorous, helping someone regain 10 degrees of shoulder flexion, teaching someone to walk without a cane, celebrating the day someone can climb stairs without stopping to rest. That's the work that doesn't make headlines. But it's the work that matters. In June, I got a letter from St. Margaret's Hospital. It was forwarded from my old address, postmarked 3 weeks earlier. I almost threw it away without opening it. But I didn't. Inside was a single-page letter, signed by the new director of rehabilitation. It said the department had undergone significant restructuring in the past 4 years. They'd implemented new billing oversight, new staff training, and a formal reporting process for workplace concerns. They wanted to acknowledge the role I'd played in prompting those changes. The letter ended with an invitation. They were hosting a patient care symposium in August and wondered if I'd be willing to speak on the topic of documentation integrity and patient advocacy. I read the letter twice. Then I called Adrian and asked what he thought. He said, "Do you want to do it?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Then let me ask a different question. If you say no, will you regret it?" I thought about that for a long time. In the end, I said yes. The symposium was held in St. Margaret's main conference hall, a wide room with high ceilings and rows of chairs facing a low stage. I hadn't been inside the hospital in 4 years. The lobby looked the same tile floors, same reception desk, same smell of antiseptic and coffee. But everything else felt different. Or maybe I was different, and the hospital had just stayed the same. I arrived an hour early. The organizer met me at the entrance and walked me through the schedule. I'd be speaking in the afternoon session, after the lunch break. 20 minutes, followed by a Q&A. The audience would be a mix of hospital staff, community providers, and students from the local PT and nursing programs. She asked if I needed anything. Water. Tea. A few minutes alone to review my notes. I said I was fine. I wasn't, but I'd learned a long time ago that fine was a functional answer. The morning sessions covered standard topics, evidence-based practice, patient engagement strategies, burnout prevention. I sat in the back and listened. Some of it was good. Some of it was generic. All of it was delivered by people who seemed earnest and competent and tired in the way that everyone in healthcare is tired. During the lunch break, a few attendees approached me. A nurse who said she'd followed the trial in the news. A PT student who said she'd taken my documentation class last semester. A man in his 60s who said he'd been a patient in the rehab department years ago and just wanted to say thank you for what I'd done. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and said I was glad he was doing well. At 1:15, the organizer called the afternoon session to order. She introduced me with a short biography, 11 years as a physical therapist, consultant on healthcare billing integrity, instructor at Spokane Community College. She didn't mention the trial directly, but she didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew. I stepped onto the stage and looked out at the audience. 200 people, maybe more. Some familiar faces. Most not. I'd prepared notes, but I didn't look at them. I said, "I'm going to tell you something my first clinical supervisor told me." She said, "The patients are always watching. Even when you think they're not paying attention, they are. They notice when you're rushed. They notice when you cut corners. They notice when you care and when you're just going through the motions. And they remember." I paused. I've been thinking about that a lot over the past few years. Because it's not just patients who are watching. It's your colleagues. Your supervisors. The people who work alongside you every day. And when something is wrong, when the system isn't working the way it's supposed to, someone always notices. The question is whether they say something. I talked for 20 minutes. I didn't tell the story of the trial, they already knew that story. Instead, I talked about documentation as a form of accountability. About the difference between a mistake and a pattern. About the responsibility we carry when we're the ones who see something no one else is paying attention to. I said, speaking up is not a betrayal. Silence is. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the applause started, not polite, not performative, but real. The QA lasted 30 minutes. People asked about how to spot billing discrepancies, how to report concerns without jeopardizing their jobs, how to know when something was serious enough to escalate. I answered every question the same way I'd answered them in depositions, in consultations, in my classroom, carefully, specifically, without softening the truth. A young woman in the third row raised her hand. She said, "What do you do when you report something and nothing changes?" I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "You document that, too. And you decide whether you can stay in a system that doesn't respond, or whether you need to find a different system. Neither choice is wrong. But both have consequences, and you're the only one who can decide which consequences you're willing to live with." She nodded. After the session, a dozen people approached me with follow-up questions, business cards, requests to connect. I answered what I could and passed along Adrian's contact information for anything legal. As the crowd thinned, a woman in her 50s stepped forward. She was wearing scrubs and a hospital badge that identified her as a nurse manager. She said, "I worked here when you did." I never said anything back then, and I've regretted it every day since. I didn't know what to say to that. She continued, "I just wanted you to know that things are different now. Not perfect. But different. And that's because of you." I said, "It's because a lot of people decided it mattered." She nodded. "Maybe. But you were the one who decided first." She shook my hand and walked away. I left the hospital just after 4. The sky was clear, the kind of late summer afternoon where the light turns everything golden. I sat in my car for a few minutes, hands on the steering wheel, and let myself feel the weight of the day. Then I drove home. Adrian was in the kitchen when I walked in, chopping vegetables for dinner. He looked up and said, "How'd it go?" I set my bag down and said, "Good." "Strange." "Good." He smiled. "That's specific." I laughed. "I'll tell you over dinner." And I did. 5 years after the trial, I stopped consulting. It wasn't a dramatic decision. I didn't announce it or send an email to the attorneys I'd been working with. I just stopped taking new cases. The last one closed in November, a billing fraud case in Portland that settled quietly, the way most of them do. I wrote my final report, sent the invoice, and filed the paperwork in the cabinet in my office. Then I closed the cabinet and didn't open it again. I'd spent 5 years looking at broken systems, documenting harm, proving patterns. I was good at it. But I was also tired of it. And I'd started to notice something: the more time I spent investigating fraud, the less time I spent doing the work I'd gone into this field to do in the first place. I wanted to go back to patience. Not part-time. Not 2 days a week. Full-time. I talked to Adrian about it one evening in early December. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the kind of aimless conversation that happens when neither of you has anywhere to be. I said, "I think I'm done with the consulting work." He looked up from his book. "Yeah?" I nodded. "I want to go back to clinical work. Maybe open my own practice." He set the book down. "What kind of practice?" I said, "Small. Outpatient. Just me, maybe one other therapist eventually. I want to work with people who've been overlooked, chronic pain cases, geriatric mobility, people recovering from injuries who've been told they're as good as they're going to get." He smiled. "That sounds like you." I said, "It'll take time to set up. Licensing, finding a space, building a patient base." He said, "You've got time." I did. I spent the next 6 months planning. I found a small office space in a strip mall on the north side of Spokane, between a coffee shop and a tax preparation service. It wasn't glamorous, but it was affordable, accessible, and had enough room for a treatment area and a small waiting room. I named it Steady Progress Physical Therapy. Adrian helped me paint the walls. My former colleague from the outpatient clinic helped me source used equipment. Vanessa sent a potted plant with a card that said, "For new beginnings." I opened in June. The first month was slow. I saw 6 patients total, 2 referrals from former colleagues, 1 walk-in, 3 who found me through the community college. But I didn't panic. I'd learned a long time ago that growth happens incrementally. You don't rebuild a shoulder in a week. You don't build a practice in a month. By the end of the summer, I was seeing 12 patients a week. By fall, 20. By the following spring, I'd hired a part-time receptionist and was turning people away because I didn't have enough hours in the day. I loved it. I loved the work in a way I hadn't loved anything in years. I loved the problem-solving, the slow progress, the moment when a patient who'd been in pain for months finally stood up and said, "It doesn't hurt anymore." I loved that I could spend a full hour with each patient and not worry about being pulled out of the room early. I loved that my notes were my own and no one was overbilling or cutting corners or pressuring me to see more people than I could see well. I loved that I'd built something that worked the way it was supposed to. Not everyone got better. Some injuries are permanent. Some pain is chronic, manageable but not curable. But even those patients left with something, a strategy, a plan, a sense that someone had taken the time to listen. That mattered. In the second year, I hired another therapist, a recent graduate named Lizette who reminded me of myself at 25. Eager, meticulous, a little too serious. I liked her immediately. I told her the same thing my first supervisor had told me, the patients are always watching. So watch them back. Pay attention. Document everything. And if you see something that doesn't make sense, say something. She nodded and said, "I will." I believed her. By the third year, the practice was stable. Not wildly profitable, but sustainable. I paid myself a salary. I paid Lizette fairly. I kept the overhead low and the quality high. I stopped working evenings. I stopped checking my phone during dinner. I started running again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. Adrian and I took a trip to the coast, the first real vacation either of us had taken in years. We stayed in a small cabin near Cannon Beach, spent the days walking along the shore, and didn't talk about work once. On the last night, sitting on the porch and watching the ocean turn dark, Adrian asked if I was happy. I thought about it. Then I said, "Yes. I think I am." He smiled. "Good." I said, "Are you?" He said, "Yeah. I am." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the waves. Then he said, "You know, for a long time I thought justice was about winning. About the verdict, the settlement, the moment when the jury comes back and says you were right." I looked at him. He continued, "But I don't think that anymore. I think justice is what comes after. It's what you build when the trial's over and everyone goes home. It's whether the system changes. Whether the person who was harmed can move forward. Whether the work mattered." I didn't say anything. He said, "I think your work mattered." I said, "I think yours did, too." We stayed on the coast for another 2 days, then drove home. 7 years after the trial, I stopped teaching. It wasn't because I didn't enjoy it, I did. But the practice had grown to the point where I couldn't do both well, and I'd always believed in doing fewer things well rather than many things poorly. I told the community college I wouldn't be renewing my contract. They asked if I'd consider guest lecturing occasionally, and I said yes. I gave my last official lecture in May. The topic was the same as it had always been: documentation integrity and patient advocacy. I told the students the same things I'd been telling them for 6 years. Some of them took notes. Some didn't. A few stayed after to ask questions. One of them, a young man named Elliot, asked, "Do you think it's worth it?" Speaking up, I mean. Even when it costs you something? I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, I can't answer that for you. But I can tell you this, staying silent costs you something, too. And that cost doesn't show up all at once. It shows up slowly, over years, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize the person looking back. He nodded slowly. I said, so yeah. I think it's worth it. But you're the only one who can decide that for yourself. He thanked me and left. I packed up my materials, turned off the lights, and walked out of the building for the last time as an instructor. It felt right. That summer, Adrian and I got married. It wasn't a big wedding. Just a small ceremony at the courthouse, followed by dinner with a dozen friends at a restaurant downtown. No white dress, no bridesmaids, no choreographed first dance. Just two people who decided they wanted to build a life together and didn't need a spectacle to make it official. Vanessa came. So did Lizette. So did a handful of former colleagues and a few of Adrian's law school friends. We didn't give speeches. We didn't make toasts. We just ate good food, drank wine, and spent the evening with people who mattered. At the end of the night, Vanessa pulled me aside. She said, I'm really happy for you. I said, thank you. She said, you know, I used to think you were fearless. But you're not, are you? I smiled. No. I'm not. She said, so how did you do it? How did you keep going when you were scared? I thought about that. Then I said, I didn't stop being scared. I just decided that being scared wasn't a good enough reason not to act. She hugged me. I'm going to remember that. I said, good. By the 8th year, the practice had become something I hadn't quite expected, a community. Patients referred their friends. Those friends referred their families. People started coming not just because they were injured, but because they'd heard this was a place where someone would take the time to listen. I hired a third therapist. Then a fourth. We moved to a larger space across town, with more treatment rooms and a small gym area for group sessions. I still saw patients 3 days a week. The other 2 days I handled administrative work, scheduling, billing, staff meetings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. One afternoon in October, a woman in her 70s came in for an initial evaluation. Her name was Diane. She'd been referred by her primary care doctor for chronic knee pain. I took her history, assessed her range of motion, and developed a treatment plan. Standard stuff. But at the end of the session, she said something that caught me off guard. She said, "You're the woman from the trial, aren't you? The one who went after St. Margaret's." I paused. Yes. She nodded. I thought so. I was a patient there, back when all that was happening. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, I'm pretty sure I was one of the people they overbilled. I didn't say anything. She continued, I just wanted to say thank you. I know it probably doesn't mean much now, all these years later. But it matters. What you did matters. I said, it means a lot. Thank you. She smiled. Well. Let's get this knee working again, shall we? We did. Over the next 3 months, Diane came in twice a week. We worked on strengthening, flexibility, gait training. By January, she was walking without pain for the first time in 2 years. On her last session, she brought me a card. Inside, she'd written, "Some people fix what's broken. You fix what people said couldn't be fixed." Thank you. I kept that card in my desk drawer for years. By the 9th year, I'd stopped thinking about the trial as the defining event of my life. It had been, for a long time. The before and after. The moment everything changed. But now, nearly a decade later, it was just one part of a longer story. An important part, yes. But not the whole thing. I was 43. I owned a business. I had a marriage that worked. I had work that mattered. I had a life that felt, most days, like mine. That was enough. One evening in late spring, Adrian and I were sitting on the back porch of the house we'd bought 2 years earlier. It was a small place, nothing fancy, with a yard just big enough for a garden. I'd planted tomatoes that spring. They were finally starting to ripen. Adrian said, "You know what I was thinking about today?" I said, "What?" He said, "That cafe. The mill. Where we met." I smiled. "What about it?" He said, "I was thinking about how neither of us was looking for anything. We were just two people drinking coffee. And somehow that turned into this." I said, "Is that a complaint?" He laughed. "No. It's an observation." I said, "What's the observation?" He said, "That the best things are usually the ones you didn't plan for." I thought about that. Then I said, "I don't know. I think the best things are the ones you choose. Even when choosing them is hard." He looked at me. "That's a very you answer." I said, "Is there any other kind?" He smiled. We sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade. Then I said, "You know what I've learned?" He said, "What?" I said, "Love survives arguments. Respect survives silence." He nodded slowly. "Yeah. I think that's right." We stayed outside until the stars came out. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what came next. I was just there, in that moment, with the person I'd chosen and the life we'd built. That was enough. 10 years after the trial, I sold the practice. Not because I had to. Not because it was failing. But because Lizette had grown into the kind of therapist I'd hoped she'd become, and she wanted to buy it. We negotiated terms over coffee, at the mill, fittingly. She'd take over ownership gradually, buying me out over 5 years. I'd stay on as a consultant for the first year, then step back completely. It felt right. I signed the papers in June. By July, Lizette had repainted the waiting room and hired 2 new therapists. By August, I was working 1 day a week, mostly handling the cases I'd been seeing for years and didn't want to hand off mid-treatment. By September, I was done. I didn't know what to do with myself at first. For 20 years, my identity had been built around work, first as a therapist, then as a consultant, then as a business owner. Without it, I felt unmoored. Adrian noticed. He didn't say anything directly, but one morning he left a brochure on the kitchen table. It was for a volunteer program training advocates for elderly patients navigating the healthcare system. I read it. Then I called the number. The training took 3 months. I learned the basics of Medicare, Medicaid, patient rights, and how to navigate disputes with hospitals and insurance companies. It was the kind of thing I'd been doing informally for years, but now it was structured, official. I liked it. By the end of the year, I was working with 4 clients, people in their 70s and 80s who'd been denied coverage, overbilled, or pressured into treatments they didn't understand. I helped them read their statements, file appeals, ask the right questions. It was quiet work. No trials, no headlines, no dramatic confrontations. Just one person helping another person understand a system designed to be confusing. It mattered. One of my clients, a man named George, had been fighting with his insurance company for 8 months over a denied surgery. The insurance company claimed the procedure wasn't medically necessary. His doctor disagreed. George was stuck in the middle, in pain, with no clear path forward. I reviewed his file, requested the denial letter, and found the clause the insurance company had used to justify the denial. It was vague, citing lack of documentation. I called the doctor's office. They'd submitted everything. The insurance company had simply decided not to read it. I filed an appeal, attached the original documentation, and included a letter explaining exactly why the denial didn't meet the company's own criteria. 3 weeks later, the surgery was approved. George called me the day he got the letter. He said, "I don't know how to thank you." I said, "You just did." By the second year of retirement, if you could call it that, I'd found a rhythm. I worked with a handful of advocacy clients. I volunteered at a local clinic one morning a week. I gardened. I read. I spent time with Adrian without feeling like I was stealing hours from something more urgent. I didn't miss the practice. I missed the patience sometimes, but I didn't miss the weight of ownership, the constant problem-solving, the sense that everything rested on my shoulders. I'd carried that weight for a long time. It was someone else's turn now. One afternoon in early spring, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was hesitant. Is this the woman who used to work at St. Margaret's Hospital? The one who? I said, yes. There was a pause. Then she said, my name is Rachel. I'm a physical therapist in Tacoma. I've been seeing some things at my clinic, billing things, that don't add up. I found an article about your case and I didn't know who else to call. I sat down. I said, tell me what you're seeing. She talked for 20 minutes. I listened. I asked questions. I told her what to document, who to contact, what her options were. At the end of the call, she said, do you think I should report it? I said, I can't make that decision for you. But I can tell you that if you don't, it won't stop. And 5 years from now, you'll wonder what would have happened if you had. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay. I'll do it. I gave her Adrian's contact information and told her to call him if she needed legal advice. She thanked me and hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that. Then I called Adrian and told him to expect a call. He said, another one? I said, yeah. He said, you could have just stayed retired. I laughed. I am retired. He said, sure you are. I said, I'm not taking the case. I'm just pointing her in the right direction. He said, that's what you said about the last 3. I said, this is different. He said, if you say so. But he was smiling. 3 months later, Rachel filed a complaint with the Washington State Department of Health. 6 months after that, her clinic was under investigation. A year later, the billing director was fired and the clinic settled with the state for $1.2 million. Rachel called me the day the settlement was announced. She said, I just wanted to say thank you. I don't think I could have done this without you. I said, you did it. I just gave you a phone number. She said, it was more than that. Maybe it was. By the 12th year, I'd stopped counting. Not the years since the trial, I still knew the date, the way you know the anniversary of anything significant. But I'd stopped measuring my life in relation to it. It was just part of my history now. One chapter in a longer book. I was 51. Adrian was 54. We were thinking about selling the house and moving somewhere smaller, maybe closer to the mountains. We talked about it the way people talk about things they might do someday, without urgency, without a timeline. We had time. One evening in October, we were sitting in the garden. The tomatoes were long gone, but the fall vegetables were coming in, kale, chard, a few stubborn carrots. Adrian said, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't kept those files? I said, sometimes. He said, what do you think? I said, I think Walter would still be working. I think the billing fraud would still be happening. I think Vanessa and the others would still be carrying what happened to them without any acknowledgement that it was real. He nodded. I said, but I also think someone else would have noticed eventually. Maybe not for another 5 years, maybe not until the damage was even worse. But someone would have seen it. He said, maybe. But it was you. I said, yeah. It was. We sat quietly for a while. Then I said, you know what I think the hardest part was? He said, what? I said, believing that it mattered. That keeping those files, reporting what I saw, going through the trial, that any of it would actually change anything. he said, did it? I thought about that. Then I said, yes. Not as much as I wanted. Not as fast as I hoped. But yes. He reached over and took my hand. I said, I think that's the thing no one tells you. That doing the right thing doesn't fix everything. It just makes the next thing possible. He said, that's pretty wise. I smiled. I've had a lot of time to think about it. We stayed outside until the air turned cold and the stars came out, bright and clear over the garden we'd planted together. And I thought, this is what I fought for. Not the verdict. Not the settlement. Not even the justice, though that mattered. I fought for the right to build a life on my own terms. To work without fear. To speak without being silenced. To choose what I was willing to carry and what I was ready to put down. I fought for this moment, and all the quiet moments like it. And in the end, that was enough.